I hate how all like broadcast stuff always starts like this with people like, I think we're live now. I think we're good. So, welcome to the Class C Block Live Edition Part 2. Um, Today we have several awesome guys here. Jeremy, why don't you just tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do real quick before we start off?
Sure. Well, thank you first for having me. My name is Jeremy Schulman. I'm currently the Director of Automation Concept Engineering at Juniper Networks, which is a made-up job, but it's awesome because it means I get to focus exclusively in the world of network automation, and I've kind of done this for the last 2.5, almost 3 years. And before that, I was a network engineer for about 8 years, and then before that, I was a software engineer for about 12 years.
Awesome. Awesome. And Tyler, can you give us a brief rundown of your history and how you got to be on this call too?
Sure. So I used to work for Beats Music before moving to Adapt TV earlier this year, in April actually. And at Adapt TV we had actually at Beats Music we had no automation, and at Adapt TV we kind of sat down and said, how do we want to make our lives easier? So the answer was Ansible, and that's how Jeremy has been fantastic. He's really worked with me and helped get things going and off the ground, fixed a couple of bugs, and that's pretty much it.
Cool. Well, I'm not going to introduce Matt Oswalt or myself because nobody cares. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about Ansible today, and then in general, we're going to branch into a discussion about network automation. That's kind of a broad subject, but just try and talk about what that's going to look like, or what we think that's going to look like in the future, and kind of what we think it looks like now. So, I am actually an Ansible newbie. I don't know really anything about Ansible. I've never used it. I've heard a lot about it, but I've never used it or anything like that. So I wanted to get some of these guys on to tell me and school me on Ansible, let me know what it is, and see if I should be using it, and if I should, why. So I'm going to let Jeremy take that away since seems to have the most experience with it. So Jeremy, if you would give us a rundown of what Ansible is, kind of how you think it compares to some of the traditional tools like Puppet and Chef, and how it's different, how it's the same, etc. So if you could give me a brief rundown, because like I said, I know nothing about it. So start from scratch for me, please.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So I would call Ansible kind of a third-generation IT configuration management framework, right? So before Ansible, there were Puppet and Chef, and then before Puppet and Chef, there was CF Engine. So CF Engine really kind of got this ball rolling as the first gen, and Puppet and Chef followed a model that had an embedded agent on each of the host targets, right? So there was this modeling mechanism where you defined what you wanted, and that arbitrary thing got sent down to the end target, and it made what you wanted into how it happened for that host. So that's kind of an agent-based model at a very high level. What Ansible does is they have an agentless model, meaning you don't have to pre-install any software on the target, and essentially it's really using the native Python infrastructure in its native mode. What makes, I think, Ansible interesting and radically simple is their approach for doing an imperative model for saying what you want to do in a specific order. They have this concept of a playbook, and a playbook is really a simple file structured in YAML, right? So YAML is kind of a structured text format, and you basically say these types of devices or these hosts do this thing, and that's a play. And then you would say this is another group of files or another group of hosts do this thing. And it is imperative, meaning you follow a set of instructions. So their canonical example that is easy to understand is they said, what if you had to upgrade a whole bunch of web servers, right? And you wanted to do 100 web servers. You need to do 10 of them at a time. And it's kind of a three-step process. You would say, I want to take 10 out of the load balancer, right? That's one play. And then the next play is I want to upgrade my web servers. And that's the second play. And then the third play is I want to put those IP addresses back in the load balancer. So they have this kind of structured playbook style, which is a little different from Puppet and Chef, where it's more of a promise theory or declarative model that says this is how I want the end state, just magically make it happen. So that's kind of the big difference to me, is that there's no agent and it's an imperative kind of mechanism. What I really liked about it was something that I could get working in like less than 2 or 3 hours for the job that I really wanted to do. And this is what's more important than anything. For networking, I wanted to do something that we do every single day, which was template build configs and deploy them on devices. And that sounds like a very simple thing to do up until the point when you get into the real world and you realize that when I want to deploy something, it gets really complicated, right? There's all these variables, there are all these template snippets, and I wanted a way to perform that simple action. I didn't want to even touch the devices. I simply wanted to do magical template building, and I didn't want to have to write a single line of code, right? I didn't want to write Python code. So their tool allowed me to do that very simply. And once I was able to kind of get my head around their structure for doing template building, and I showed it to the guys at Ansible, I said, look, I had this really complicated data center, and I was able to template build every single piece of device. And they're like, wow, that's really kind of not that interesting because we do template building all the time in DevOps. What would be more interesting is if you actually made it work with your devices and talk to your devices and did the software upgrade and all the things that you want to do when you set up a data center. And I said, wow, that would be really cool, but I have no idea. How would I do that? And then they showed me how their module system worked, and then from there, we are where we're at. So I'll take a pause there. I kind of like rambled a bit.
No, but I mean, that's kind of cool because you're right. I am used to the kind of like server client, so to speak, model when it comes to the automation tools. So the kind of the big question that comes to my head, and this isn't really a critique. This is really a question: is how does that model scale? Like whenever you have, say, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of devices, do you have just one Ansible server that's handling all the communication between all those different devices, or can it scale out? How does that look whenever you want to have potentially hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of devices that you're talking to?
Yeah, excellent question. So the way that Ansible works in its canonical form is like this. In your play, you basically say, here's a collection of hosts, right? So you might say a web server is a group of hosts, and there might be 10 or 100 web servers. And then in that play, you define a series of actions or tasks to take. And every task is kind of a unit of action or some kind of thing that you want to do. Maybe template build a file or copy a file or start a service, things that the DevOps guys do. The way Ansible works is every task is a little piece of Python code, and the server ships that piece of Python code down to the device and executes it. And then the result of that execution is JSON, in which the server consumes and then uses to process, right, in terms of what was the result and what changed and what not. So there's this kind of distributed nature of execution, right? They're sending Python down, it's executing, and then it, poof, it gets deleted. The way they do this in parallel is they'll do 5 things at a time. So if you had a collection of web servers, it would actually fork 5 of these things simultaneously and talk to 5 of them simultaneously, because in IT DevOps, their management is generally what I call a leaf node problem, meaning web servers are leaf nodes, in kind of our IT infrastructure, right? They're an end thing. So they will do 5 of those things in parallel at a time, and you can change the fork number if you want. If you want to do 10 things at a time or 100 things at a time, depending on the nature and capacity of your server.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so as the thing is processing, it's only doing 5 things at a time, even though it might be running through a series of 100 things, if that makes sense.
So there is no client. However, the host that you're speaking to does need to run Python because it'll actually send down a module, run it locally, and then send back the JSON.
Yeah, so that's what in this native or canonical form, like if you don't do anything special, that's what it will do by default. Now, one of the things that Ansible, I think, is really focused on is the hybrid public-private cloud problem. Their focus, I think, where they really excel is how can I manage my infrastructure, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud. And when you're talking about a public cloud, you're really running a bunch of APIs, like talking to Rackspace or Amazon or DigitalOcean or things like that. And when you're doing that kind of API mechanism, then the connection model is different. It says, I want to run my module or my Python actually on my Ansible server because it's running from my Ansible server and talking remotely. And it was this technique that the guys at Ansible told me use this mode. It's called connection local, right? So if you use connection local, that means all of your tasks or your modules will run locally on the Ansible server. And because when I need to talk to Junos, right, and I'm making a netconf connection, which is essentially an API connection, and Junos doesn't have Python natively on the box, then the modules that we built, they basically, when they run, open up a connection to Junos, do the thing over the XML API, and then close up when they're done.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense, because then it's, yeah, you're right. Like, you're not going to be able to just shoot down a module to a Juniper box or really any box that's in a closed ecosystem like that and be able to run that module and spit back JSON. So you're running it locally, and even to like a AWS, that would talk REST to AWS and then get the information back, and then the local agent running on the Ansible server would spit back the JSON for the output, correct?
Absolutely. You got it.
Okay. That makes sense. So one other question I have considering Ansible is how can I programmatically make calls to Ansible to run playbooks and or modules, etc. I don't really know the terminology, but like if I wanted to write some sort of script that kicked off maybe an update service at X time, can I write a little Python script that will actually make all of the Ansible calls for me and I'll orchestrate that entire process, or is that still manual?
So good question. I think there's two types of approaches you can take. One is that Ansible itself has a Python library, so you could write Python code to manipulate that library and execute those things. And I don't have a lot of experience with that library myself, so I can't tell you too much about it. They also have a commercial product, which is what they call Ansible Tower, and that is a full-blown REST-based server technology that you can like send commands to and say, run this playbook, and here's some variables and whatnot. And so it's kind of that server-based technology that has role-based access controls and very sophisticated mechanisms of databases and whatnot. And it also has a really nice GUI on the front end, which the GUI, from what I understand, talks to that same REST API. So their GUI interface is using the same REST API. So in the production customers that we have that are using Ansible, they're actually using Ansible Tower in this way, because when you're talking about connecting holistic IT systems together, you really do need that RESTful interface to glue all of these pieces together. You might say, I need to go to this database and grab some variables and pass those variables to, say, the Ansible Tower REST interface. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Especially and you're not gonna want to go reinvent the wheel. I mean, like, just because you can get access to the library for free, who really wants to go write all that code to turn around and create a REST API that has already been written that you could just pay for?
Yeah, but I mean, when I look at any of these tools, just to kind of bring it back into the world of networking, I look at these tools as I'm trying to do a job. What tool can get me how can I lessen my gratification gap, so to speak? If I'm trying to template build 100 different pieces of equipment in a data center, how quickly can I get that done? And Ansible was the fastest way for me to get that done without having to write a line of code, because most of the networking professionals I talk to, they're not programmers. They're just putting their toe in the water. They're just getting started, but they need to do these jobs. They need to template build configs, and this is a great tool for not having to write code to do it.
Right. And the truth is the way in which we want to interact with devices, especially given the traditional model of networking, has to be done with a clientless orchestration tool. Because I mean, even if you wanted to, you couldn't really use Chef on a Cisco box, and even if you wanted to, you couldn't use Puppet on a Cisco box. And so the ability to be able to do that without a client is pretty powerful, just when you're talking about the traditional way of thinking about orchestration inside of networking. And so I can see why Ansible gets a lot of play in the networking side of the house just based on that alone.
I agree. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
So I'd like to I feel like I've kind of gotten my appetite wet on the Ansible stuff. So if we can shift gears just a little bit and start talking generally about network automation, I'd like to talk about some of the work that Jeremy, you've been doing, Matt, you've been doing on Ansible modules and how you are trying to tie, Jeremy, obviously you with Junos and what you're trying to do, tying all that in with PyEasy, the stuff that you've written there, and tying that all into Ansible, and then Matt, what you're doing with the Nexus API and how you're tying that into Ansible, etc. I'd like to get some feedback on what y'all are doing there, how that's going, how y'all think that'll look, etc. Matt, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I work for a Cisco VAR. We've got a few Nexus 9Ks in the lab, and one of the new features with the whole 9K line is the NX API, which, let me just real quick summarize that. It's not a full-featured, robust API like what we think of in traditional network APIs like NetConf. NX API is essentially a way to pass CLI commands into the switch, which is normally very, very meh, except that this particular flavor happens to pre-parse all of the information when you get return information. So it's not terrible, it's not perfect, but it's not terrible either. It's better than SSH scraping. So right now, what I'm currently doing is I'm working on two things. First off, I've been building, Jinja 2 templates for NXOS for a while, just trying to hash out how I want them to be, divvied up, how I want them to be, basically how I want that templatizing to go. So like if I had like a role. And I'm getting into Ansible territory, but if I had the idea of what a switch should be or what kind of features it should have, then I could impart only the relevant configuration data onto it. I'll give you an example. A Nexus 3K never runs Fibre Channel, so I would never place any sort of Fibre Channel zoning configuration onto it or any WWPNs, anything like that. Whereas the 5Ks, for instance, do run Fibre Channel and they run FCOE and they make use of those snippets. So that's the stuff that I'm working out, and I've found that Ansible is actually really, really powerful for that because that's all frameworky stuff that I don't want to have to rewrite if I don't have to. So Ansible is really, really good for that kind of stuff. And then on the 9Ks,
real quick, tell me what Jinja 2 is for the people who don't know what Jinja 2 is.
Yeah, so Jinja 2 and Jeremy's, I'm sure, been using this for a lot longer than I have.
Those tools all the time that we're just like, so yeah, I got some Jinja 2 templates and blah blah blah. It's like, what? Yeah.
No, so Jinja 2 is basically a templating language. You can think of it like you could create an entire network configuration, the same as you would put into a Notepad document before you literally paste it into a switch, except that it gives you the ability to insert little variables here and there. And it's denoted by a curly braces notation, and the documentation is very easy to read. So I don't know what the site is, but just Google Jinja 2, JINJA2. And basically what it allows you to do is it allows you to insert variables into a text file. So let's say your text file is an NXOS configuration. Well, it would be very trivial for me to replace the argument for the hostname command in my configuration with that curly braces notation and then stick a variable name in there. So then it takes, I think, like maybe 2 or 3 lines of Python to render that configuration and basically say, I want to generate an instance of this template, but with these variables filled out. And so you supply the values for those variables. Now, of course, the really powerful way of using a templating language like that is in a framework like Ansible, where those hostname parameters and all kinds of parameters like that are supplied via variables or inventory files. I'll give you an example. As Jeremy said, when you have an inventory file in Ansible that shows you all of your network switches on your network, or maybe what you want to create, you basically build that list ahead of time in a very simple way in YAML. Right? It's extremely readable, it's easy to use, it's easy to understand. And then using some Ansible modules, either the ones that we've created or maybe default modules, you can generate instances of these configs in an automated fashion. And then on the other side, you can actually use another module to deploy those configs. So from inception, which is I'm going to define configuration in a very easy to read way, easy to understand way, I'm going to generate a template. And then from that, I'm actually going to deploy that template. The speed of configuration, especially for, just in the VAR space, I know this is painful for guys in like staging, for instance, where you get a customer that needs to deploy like 50 switches. It is a godsend to be able to deploy those kind of configurations in that quick of a way. And there's always going to be some corner cases like, I need to make this one little configuration on this one little switch, maybe like a couple weeks after the fact, but certainly for the large majority of the configuration, it's a huge time saver. And that's just staging. I mean, think of all the things that you can do that aren't viewed as like, dangerous. Things like changing SNMP community strings, or just passwords in general. Templatizing that stuff and then pushing it out via a framework like Ansible saves an incredible amount of time, just because you don't have to rewrite anything that's already been done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's my main focus. I'm trying to build those kind of things for NXOS. I haven't yet decided if I'm really going to keep going with this NX API thing or try to go the netconf route. Netconf on NXOS is still kind of weird, so I still haven't yet to answer that question. But yeah, so it's a work in progress. But I think the important thing isn't really the protocol. The important thing is how I'm allowing network engineers to interface with these tools. So my goal is to build these Ansible modules in a way that they don't have to worry about the inner workings of the module. And a decision between NX API or netconf is almost certainly something that's hidden in the module. The user shouldn't ever have to change anything based on what configuration protocol I'm using, in my opinion. Because the goal for a module builder is to enable those that are using the module to do so in a very, very easy fashion. So that's my goal. And Jeremy's done a fantastic job of that with his Junos module.
Yeah, and that would be a good segue into Jeremy, if you could speak a little bit about what, kind of the same thing, just what you're doing on the Juniper side of the house.
Sure, yeah. So I like to use Ansible for one specific purpose that we use in networking professionals 100% of the time, which is deploying new equipment, right? And so that's the only use case. It's, how do I deploy new kit? So imagine you were to walk into a brand new data center, right? And you had, 500 pieces of kit, switches, routers, firewalls. Maybe your routers were different roles, meaning maybe some of them are core routers and maybe some of them are internet routers, and you have different types of security boxes. You have, a security box that did inter-data center, security, and you have a firewall that did internet routing. So this concept of roles is very, very important in Ansible, because when you have a role or you have a group, Ansible allows you to define variables associated to those roles and groups. And when you get into this really complex set of equipment, the real question is if I walk into that data center and everything's racked and powered, but nobody's touched a single box, how quickly can I put the right version of code on all the boxes, put the right base config on all of those boxes, right? Or some people call that the infrastructure config, right? That question is what I use Ansible to solve the answer for. If I can say I can walk into a data center and I can stand up that data center in a day because I've set up all the variables and have set up all the templates ahead of time, and I just say, here's an inventory of data associated to groups and roles, go. And then it goes through each step. First step, connect to box, see what you are. Okay, I know what you are. I know what role you're in. Okay, do you have the right version of code? No, you don't. Let me upgrade you. And then I'm going to wait for you to reboot, and then I'm going to template build your config, and then I'm going to deploy your config. Right? That same basic workflow can be applied universally to every single piece of equipment, regardless of is it a firewall, a switch, or a router, or its role, because the way Ansible's framework is defined. And that's the only thing I use it for right now. That's it. It's great for configuration management or deployment. After the equipment is set up and staged, how you want to deal with the lifecycle management, like adding firewall policies or adding VLANs or just the lifecycle of the equipment, I leave that for a different tool.
So that's actually really badass, Jeremy. I didn't really even think of it that way, but that's essentially, especially as a VAR that goes into environments that are, maybe not really well maintained, we'll say, in a very nice way. It's a great way to just say, hey, look, there's a bunch of things that you could point to as part of some of the problems and heartache that you're feeling. Here's sort of an easy button to get your environment up to a known working configuration. You know what I mean? Something that's a little cleaner and a little better to easier to manage. That's pretty sexy in my opinion.
Thank you. That's cool.
So if you guys don't mind me jumping in real quick.
So can you talk a little bit, Jeremy, about? Yeah.
Sorry. So I kind of come from the other side of the house where you guys are VARs and vendors. I deal with production all day long. So we have actually taken what Jeremy's done, and we're using it more with a continuous deployment life cycle for our network equipment. So we're not using it for initial configuration. We're not using it to deploy 100 devices. We're using it to maintain and do continuous deployment with the network. So if we need to make a change, like if we need to add a new VLAN, we open up a YAML file, we edit it, we add the new VLAN, put the port in the VLAN, whatever, and it gets checked into Git, and we have a piece of software running on top of it called Gerrit that allows for code and change review. So we also do change review, and once you commit it, Gerrit will automatically push the config to the devices using Ansible. So we're using it for production changes, not just initial setup, but to manage the entire infrastructure end-to-end, regardless of what the device is.
So that's interesting. I'm familiar with Gerrit.
The natural question to that is, has it broken? And if it has, how bad?
No, it hasn't broken. I don't foresee it breaking. If it breaks, it's probably the result of misconfiguration, which you would have if you were typing at a command line, and you're probably more likely to make that mistake at a command line than you are through a template system where you're editing YAML files and not trying to type out, series of commands in the correct order and with the correct values, no typos, and so on.
So let me. If there's anything to take from that, it's that you can do this in production and it not break anything, because I think a lot of times that's the big scary thing is people are like, well, if I use a script, it's going to run amok and go start erasing all my configs. Well, it doesn't do anything you don't tell it to do. And so if there's anything I think that's valuable out of this conversation, it's that right there, is that you can use this in production and use it well.
Yeah, and so we actually delete the entire configuration and rebuild it every time. So
wow.
It's not just a matter of how can I add things, it's how do I ensure the integrity of the configuration, because if you need to, like we use SSH keys, so there's no central authentication for SSH keys in network equipment right now. So we have to define SSH keys in every device. Ansible makes it super easy, but if you don't delete the entire configuration, or at least that section, when you do the Ansible deploy, then you have no way to remove users in a programmatic manner. So we just blow the whole
problem
thing.
With hanging around. Did you catch that?
No, sorry.
Y'all have like zero problem with config hanging around that shouldn't be there.
Exactly. As long as you put forth the effort to make sure that the sections get deleted, then there's no problems. And we also have each section defined as we have overarching roles. So like a router has OSPF and BGP, and we also have more specific roles, like one BGP router might be a route reflector and one might be a client. But within each role we have tags. Like there's a system config that deploys the entire system, but there's also individual tags for different tasks in that role. Like, so there's one for authorization. If you only want to rebuild the authorization for all of your devices, then you tell Ansible only deploy the authorization tag, and it will only.
Did we lose Tyler? There he is. Matt, I know you were trying to jump in there. What were you trying to add?
Oh, I think he actually answered my question. Well, I was mostly just interested in how he has it laid out. It sounds like, Tyler, there he is. So
Yeah,
Tyler, it sounds like It sounds like basically you've created a situation just like any other, open source project. You've got all of the network engineers as part of, like, the contributor base, and then you've got one or two, we'll call them committers because that's the open source lingo. But those guys sort of serve as your knowledgeable change control approvers in a sense. Does that sound about right?
So there is only me. I'm actually the only network engineer, but
by commit review, you mean like you come back a couple of days and you're like, that was a smart change,
no.
me.
So,
I'm going to approve that.
He goes back and he plus ones his own commits, and he's like, yeah.
No, so there's ops people that I work with, but I'm the only network engineer. So it kind of gets a little dicey in that respect, but to be fair,
Yeah, I think we lost him again.
Was that just
Bad
me,
commit.
or did the whole thing die?
Oh, we can
No, you're
see
back.
now. You
Oh,
dropped for a
Google.
second.
Okay. So anyway, sorry. But no, the ops guys handled the network before me, but they're not network engineers.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay.
yeah, it's a little dicey in that respect of, well, who approves if you're the only one? But that ecosystem is possible.
Yeah. And it'll be really easy to bring somebody into that when junior guy comes along or employee network engineer 2 comes along.
Exactly. And there's other components of the system, like Ansible will automatically, or well, not Ansible, but we have our system set up to automatically push the config every 30 minutes. So that also prevents rogue changes to the devices. Somebody makes a change to the device 30 minutes later, it doesn't matter.
So,
Yeah.
so one of the
That's
things
interesting.
that Tyler said that is, I think, really critical to kind of highlight is the fact that they've disassociated or they've done this. I'm going to check in my YAML files, right, into Git, so they're version controlling everything. So that's really an important concept, version controlling things. But disassociating data, meaning the YAML files, from the templates, right, which is the how does my what become the how, is really, really important because you can get a level of validity checking going on in the process if you wanted to add it. Meaning, if I check in a YAML file, I can make sure the contents of that YAML file is correct before I even proceed to the next step of template building. And this way, if somebody put in a bad VLAN number or a bad route or something like that, you actually can automate aspects of this overall workflow. And I think that's really kind of the progressive step here. The first step, I think, is network professionals need to get in the habit of building templates and disassociating their data and version controlling that. Whether it's Jinja 2 because we're all using Python or some, whatever comes out, in 5 years from now. But right now it's Python and Jinja 2, and that's really nice and easy. So YAML, Jinja 2. If everybody could learn that and get really comfortable with that, that's a great first step. And then the next step after that is how do we insert some, validity check in that process? And then we just keep building on this process until we get more and more comfortable as a community using these types of tools. And the other thing that Tyler said that was really key is that he collaboratively works now with the other DevOps or the ops guys, and they're all kind of speaking the same vernacular. They're starting to use, Git as a community or some of these tools together. This is really the magic, in my opinion, when you talk about network automation. It's how we work together. We start using the same kind of tools. It doesn't mean we have to use the same tools. It doesn't mean like since the server guys are using Puppet, we have to use Puppet. There's always a stack of tools, and people mix and match tools all the time. But getting in the general workflow together is essential. And I think Tyler in production doing this is phenomenal. I think this is just that to me, as Matt said, that's sexy and hot. What Tyler is doing, I think, is really sexy and hot.
And two, like there's stuff to be learned on both sides of the fence, right? There's some things that DevOps could probably learn from the networking guys and vice versa. Like even if traditional network engineers just started pushing their config every time they created a new config with Git, and they could get diffs on that, etc. Like even just that alone would add so much more to the traditional life cycle of managing your equipment in production. Now, that's obviously not the nirvana we'd like to live in because it's so far detached from what we actually can do today. But it's still a lot better than what they've traditionally done. Now, we did have Tyler. We had a question from somebody on Twitter who's watching live, and speak about this as comfortably as you feel, given that it's a private company and all that. But they asked what type of kit you were running against. You were running the Ansible code against, like what I'm assuming what vendor, and then if you have any of the Ansible modules that you've built available publicly.
So the great thing about Ansible is that it's multi-vendor. We're primarily big name vendors. Jeremy, obviously, I've worked with, so definitely Juniper. We're using his modules.
Okay.
There's nothing custom. I'm working on some that do some validity checks. Is OSPF in a full status? Are the BGP neighbors established?
Right. Okay.
But they're not currently being used in production. There are also F5 Ansible modules for putting members in and out of service in pools so that you can do server upgrades. There are Arista Ansible modules that you can use. It's a fantastic ecosystem. What's that? Sorry?
I said soon to be Cumulus Ansible modules.
Yeah.
I had to get my plug in there.
The stuff that's out there, if you're Juniper or Arista primarily, the modules are out there. The Juniper GitHub organization holds the Ansible module from Jeremy and his team. It's really easy to get up and running. I have a post on my site getting up and running with Juniper, Ansible, and doing the style of production continuous deployment that we're doing at my job.
Nice. And I would say this too, like a lot of times the things that I hear repetitively complained about on Twitter and stuff like that, people have solved that problem more than once. People had that problem solved before any of these tools were available. It's getting easier to solve, and so instead of complaining about it, there's ways to fix it, and I think we should all be working towards this new kind of style of managing your production networks. And so I would like to try and take kind of what we've been talking about, and Tyler specifically, what y'all are doing in production today, and like you said, you're not really doing anything fancy. You just took Ansible, took some modules that were already written by Juniper, merged them in together, and you have this whole kind of change control and change provisioning and provisioning without really doing anything fancy. And so it can be done today. And so I'd like for us to have a little bit of a conversation with, if we're here now, and we hear a lot of talk from everybody about things from networking and is the foundation of networking is being rocked and it's going to look completely different in 2 years, to everybody's CCIE is worthless, to you hear the gamut of different things, and there's a whole lot of talk about everything from the very simplest stuff all the way to the very complex. And so I'd like to have just a little conversation about where we think in general network automation is going, why we think that CCIEs aren't worthless, and kind of where we see, I guess, the whole field kind of moving as we move more towards a DevOps model. And Jeremy, I know you've spoken about this in a couple of classes and stuff like that, so I'd be interested to hear kind of your take on that. And then Matt and Tyler, I'd like to also get your practical take on kind of how things are moving. So, Jeremy, you want to start that off for us?
Yeah, thank you. So, first off, I think that network professionals need better tools. They don't need to be required to be better programmers, at least not today. I mean, if people want to learn programming and add that to a skill set, I think that's awesome and we should encourage that. But fundamentally, we need better tools that help us think like a programmer but not require us to be a programmer. And what we're doing with Ansible right now is exactly that. We're saying we're going to take the vast knowledge that CCIEs or JNCIEs have, which is the templates or the config snippets that they have, right? And that's in their brain. They know what the config snippets need to be, right? Somebody still has to build the config snippets. That's what the CCIEs and JNCIEs, that's what these guys are good at. Like, how do I formulate what snippets to put together, and then how to think like a programmer and structurally decompose my data variables. How do I want to structure my YAML files? What are the variables? How are they going to come together? But beyond that, we need just good tools to make the process of combining the templates and the variables together easier. For this particular problem, we'll call this config deployment, right? That's one problem that we have in networking. We have many other problems in networking, like doing health audits and daily monitoring and checking. There's so much more that we do in networking, which is more akin to application deployment monitoring in the DevOps world. And this is a key thing that I think a lot of people miss. When you talk about tools like Puppet and Chef and Ansible and Salt, these are configuration management tools that do a specific thing, which is get the middleware layer up and running on these servers. You have the right packages, you have the right files, are the services running. But the guys that do the application deployment, that's a whole different set of tools in many cases, right? So for me, where I think people should be going in networking is, getting better tools, right? You guys are on this call. I mean, we might be the tool builders, of tomorrow, but until the DevOps guys went through this era where they had Puppet and Chef and Ansible, they were doing everything like we're doing it right now, manually or ad hoc bash scripting, right? I would hate to see our industry just start writing a whole bunch of Python code as automation engineers, because then we're just repeating the history of DevOps. We need better tools like Ansible to really help us as an industry go forward. So that's kind of my shtick. I think you've heard me talk about that in classes and whatnot.
So you're saying, like, we don't need individual network engineers to go write Python scripts ad hoc from each other to provision X, Y, and Z and reinvent the wheel a million different times. We can skip all of that junk because we've had a good model laid out for us before on the DevOps side of things and the application management side of things and the server management side of things. We can skip all the way to where we are now on the server management side of things if we will let it. And so if we can take tools like Ansible, if we can take tools like Puppet or Chef, and potentially modify them minorly to work with what we're trying to do, we don't have to go through all the pain of, well, I'm a networking engineer and I've got 100 switches to deploy X on, and so I'm going to go write this ad hoc Python script to do just that. And then the same guy that's down the street at another company says, well, I've got 100 switches that I need to go provision the exact same thing that this guy down the street did, so let me go build a Python script that's going to push all this out. No, let's skip to Z, open source all that junk, push it to a GitHub repository. The guy down the street says, oh, hey, he already wrote, an Ansible module that does exactly this or ties into my devices exactly in the same way. Let me just go pull his. Boom, I'm done.
Yeah, so I mean,
very glamorized view, by the way.
Yeah, very glamorized. I agree with that. I mean, I think that there are some tools that we have today that we can bend to the will of networking. Like the way we're using Ansible is a clever use of Ansible. It was not built for the networking community, but it's useful, right? It's useful for what we can make it do. I think that there needs to be a new generation of tools for networking, like Ansible or Puppet or Chef, but it's something that takes the concepts and ideas of the DevOps world and create new tools that work for the networking mind or the networking workflow patterns. Because I think that the IT tools are built for leaf nodes. They're built for the leaves of a tree, and networking are these hierarchical, complex systems. They are the trunks and the branches and the boughs of the tree, so to speak. And the tools to fundamentally manage systems like that are different, in my opinion, and we need better tools. Now, who's going to build those tools and how they're going to come about? I think this is a ripe area, right? And it's something that I'm passionate about, so you'll see me be active in these areas, of course. So, but that's where I think. Now, there's going to be a gap, right? Because we don't have those tools right now. People will have to write stuff, whether it's a network engineer who's writing something in Python, or it's DevOps buddy, or maybe a company has money and they're going to outsource the tool development. I mean, there's a big tools gap in the market right now, and so we're in that space or the space in time where people are going to have to write their own stuff, and it's going to be rough. It's going to be a rough period of time until we find ourselves with better tools.
Yeah, things will break more often than not in this time.
Yeah. So here's my advice, though, to the people who are out there who want to write automation tools, right? If you're going to do configuration change kind of tools, follow the model that we're doing with Ansible. Build with templates so you can see the result before you push it to a push it to a device, right? You need that visibility. And the second thing is, if you're going to write really cool automation tools, do what I call read-only automation, like the troubleshooting kinds of things. You're extracting data. You're just doing read-only kinds of things, where you can't damage your network, so to speak, because you're not making changes. I think that's a really good area to get our feet wet, practice. And the third thing that I would say is, I want the networking vendors to build more virtual machine kind of systems so that we can practice. Like, I can't, have a T-series in my house to practice. I would like more VMs. Like, please, 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 more VMs. Juniper's doing some VMs in this area. Other vendors have VMs in this area. I know, I think Cumulus has got something you can use. I think Arista's got something you use. Brocade Vallada's got something you can use. I mean, we're getting there, right? But the reason why the DevOps guys can hyper accelerate what they do is because they can spin up a virtual machine and then blow it away, and nobody's harmed. We don't have that yet, but we're getting there slowly. We're getting there. All right, I'll show you.
There's nothing more frustrating than having exactly what you have in your head and what you want to do, how you want to automate it, but then having no resources by which to actually test that against. And so if your only kit is in production, you're not about to be like, well, let me go try this new script that I wrote that I'm pretty sure will work on this production stuff.
You guys now know my pain.
Because the real fun stuff is not the read-only stuff.
What's the fun stuff?
So the really fun stuff is not the read-only stuff.
What is the really fun stuff then?
The not having to touch 100 switches to provision one VLAN or something like that.
Oh yeah. Amen, brother. Amen.
So Matt, Tyler, either of y'all jump in here. What do y'all think kind of is where we're at, where the future is, kind of similar to what Jeremy was talking about?
Go ahead, Tyler. You go first.
So I think that everybody's kind of on a different page. Jeremy says do the not fun stuff, the read-only automation, and I take the opposite approach. The read-only automation is entirely useless to me. When I'm troubleshooting an issue, I'm usually only connecting to 2 devices. I don't need automation to connect to 2 devices and tell me if OSPF is up. I probably have to do a bunch of other stuff in those devices anyway. So right now, I think that people are afraid of doing this stuff in production. And they don't want to take the first steps. And even if they take the read-only steps, they're not going to want to take the push to production steps. And that is an extremely important step to take. We're not going to get anywhere if everybody is afraid to push their changes to production. If you've got to do it in a change window, do it in a change window. If you're more agile and you can do a and that's where I think the network's going to be, is we've got continuous deployment for apps and for systems. We don't have continuous deployment for the network in most places. That's where we're going to be in 5 years, maybe 2 years, whatever, it doesn't matter. But this is where we're going to be. We're not going to need change windows anymore. And this is why the CCIE will never be useless, or the JNCIE, or whatever it happens to be, because you can't have just anybody orchestrating a continuous deployment type of scenario. Not for the network. It just doesn't work. What's CodeSpace? They just went up in flames, probably because they had developers trying to do ops. And that's kind of a danger of the whole DevOps movement, is it's also empowering a bunch of devs to be ops, and then companies think that they don't need ops. You've got to have ops. You've got to have CCIEs. It doesn't matter how good your toolkit is, your design, your architecture, even the implementation of the toolkit has to come from your CCIE.
Mm-hmm.
And I think these tools are going to enable the CCIEs of the world to start doing production changes. You want to add a VLAN? Who cares? Do it in production. Let your toolkit do it for you. You want to bring up new OSPF? Do it in production. Set the cost to whatever, 50,000 on the link. Do it in production. Then bring the cost. Test the link, obviously. Then use your automation to bring the cost of the link down, and you're done. There's too much fear in the industry in general right now, I think. And I guess that's because everything lives on the network.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I'll start by saying I agree, Tyler, with most of what you're saying. I think one of the things I have visibility into, I see a lot of environments that are exactly as you describe, very afraid to make changes, and it's either that they're afraid or that they don't really care to make changes because ultimately they're not the ones that are really benefiting from speeding things up. Depends on the size of the organization. But I think generally, one of the underpinnings, if I could sort of pontificate on what I think a lot of these organizations are missing is proper testing, right? And this goes back to the VM conversation. If you have this production environment, right, and not everybody can build sort of a one-for-one topology in a lab that mimics their production. That's just not realistic. One of the things, though, obviously the VM route is possible. If you're using Cisco gear, not as possible. But the cool thing, I think, in my mind, is if you really care about doing things the right way and getting over that fear of automation, there are certain things that you can do. Maybe building a smaller topology, maybe saying, I want to automate this one task, so I really only need the gear that's used for that one task. Maybe a BGP peer. You really only need 2 routers for that, for instance. Very simple, modularizing and doing things incrementally, I think, but making sure that one test case is vetted and that you record the version of code that's used. I mean, every single thing about that. That's kind of what I think one of the things Jeremy alludes to when he says think like a programmer without actually being a programmer, is because that's what programmers really are supposed to do, is they test every scenario possible. I think that's probably one of the best ways you can get over the fear of network automation. So I encourage, whenever I talk to people about this, customers, that I always, and you're absolutely right, most of them are just afraid of making changes in production. But I say, what would it take for you to get just like any form of testing done in the lab? And the reality is they just haven't done it, in my opinion, from what I've seen.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, and I was actually about to comment on that. The biggest thing that you can do to have a successful automation deployment is quality control, is quality assurance, is testing on every single type of device that you will have, every single model number that you have, and every single code release that potentially could be running on those boxes. You have to test every single bit of that to make sure that whenever you deploy this, and do it on small scales, do 5 devices at a time, do 10 devices at a time, and roll it out over time to make sure that you minimize the damage in case something does go wrong. And so I think there are ways in which you can do that, and good QA is definitely one of the things that will kind of CYA, if you know what I mean, and prevent things from going wrong, so you can actually have a successful automation implementation. I would like to kind of pose a question here, and this is not like trolling. I'm legitimately curious on what y'all think as we start talking about software-defined X. My take on it has always been it's more about management plane consolidation and bringing that to a single point of management than it is about control plane management and separating the control plane from the data plane. So I'm curious just to get a kind of a feel out for there. I mean, obviously, as time has gone on, OpenFlow has gotten less and less publicity in light of different and new things that have come out, like overlays and ACI, etc. So I'm curious, as y'all see things progressing towards SDN, how much of that do you think will involve programmability? And when I say that, I mean more things like the style of OpenFlow versus management plane centralization. I'm curious to see what the opinion is on that. And obviously, I think we probably would all agree that there's going to be some combination of both. But I'm curious to see on which side of the fence do you think will lean heavier, more towards the programmability or more towards the management centralization?
So I have thoughts on this, but I want to give these guys a chance to talk because I feel like I'll last a long time if I start.
So I'd like Tyler to go first then, because I want to hear what you guys say on this.
Okay, so the whole software-defined X thing.
The wolves are at your door, Tyler. The wolves are at your door.
They usually are. So the software-defined X thing kind of sucks.
Great start.
Tell me how you really feel.
Yeah, well, it's meaningless. It doesn't really mean anything. You ask 50 different people the same question, they're going to give you 50 different answers guaranteed. The origins of things like RSVP are proof that nobody wants this, really. They think they do, but nobody wants programmable class of service, right? I mean, the idea is ridiculous. You don't give any control to the leaf to control how the network works. It's asinine, to be honest. You could potentially destroy your network, destroy your SLAs. Maybe if there was a way to make it only so that the network engineers could do this sort of thing, fine. But control plane level stuff, I highly doubt that it'll happen. From a management perspective, I think that what would be awesome is to say, I want OSPF between this device and this device. No configuration, no thinking about timers, none of that. Just say, I have these two devices, give me OSPF. And Ansible kind of makes that possible, but not to the degree that I think that it will eventually be. So the software-defined whatever, look at SNMP. Okay, we had SNMP before any of this stuff, and we could change configuration with SNMP. It's a really shitty way to do it, but whatever. Same thing with screen scraping. Perl scripts have been legendary for this sort of thing. None of this is new, and everybody treats it like it's the second coming of whatever, or reincarnate whatever. And it's really just not the case. It's not as big of a deal as people are making it seem. The more important thing is how you think about your network and how you move forward.
All right, Jeremy, do you want to go now, or do you want Matt to go first? I have an opinion on this too, but I kind of want to go last. I'm the dealer, so I'm going to go last on this poker match.
All right. Well, I'll be short because I could go on for a very long time on this topic. Only because I have in my history as a software engineer, I used to write microcode for network processors. So that was like SDN before that term ever existed, and I have kind of a viewpoint. I have a point of view from my experience writing software for network processors, essentially. And when OpenFlow and all of this stuff came out, I tweeted once, how do you set a breakpoint in OpenFlow? Because if I can't debug software, I can't write software. And that tweet was ignored. So I'll just leave it at that. I believe that the vast number of customer conversations that I have when it comes to quote-unquote automation and SDN, I would tell you that 90% of those conversations are rotating around management automation, the stuff that we're talking about with Ansible and these other tools. They are not talking about writing OpenFlow or control plane applications. Those conversations only happen when I'm talking with university kind of customers because they're getting grants to explore this area for future ideas, which I think is fine. That's fine. But in the real world, when we're trying to deploy networks and sell services and have businesses run our networks, I think the vast amount of energy should be placed on how do we give networking professionals better tools to do the jobs that they have today, right now? Right now, it's like we all have screwdrivers. We need power screwdrivers. We don't need robots with power screwdrivers. We just need better screwdrivers, power screwdrivers, right? That's my analogy. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd really like to hear what Matt has to say.
Well played, since we're both not.
No, so I'll be brief because I think you guys have really summed up sort of part of my opinion. My thought is that first off, whenever I say the word SDN, I typically don't actually mean control plane centralization or OpenFlow. I think the story has progressed enough that we sort of collectively know, hopefully, that it's obviously what we're trying to describe is obviously more than that. And I agree with Tyler's statement that there's really not much of this or any of this that's new. I think the general reason why this is one of the general reasons, I think there's many reasons, but one of the reasons why SDN is getting so much attention, so much hype, is because there's really two factors. First off, most small to medium, and I'll just lump those together. I know it's a huge generalization, but there's a ton of organizations in general out there that aren't even doing the basic automation, basic network automation, basic management. SDN at this point has really been just utterly productized, right? And I try to have conversations with people every once in a while, and it's frustrating when I hear in these conversations that whenever I try to talk in abstract terms about what SDN means to me, maybe network automation, whatever you want to call it, I don't believe the two are the same, but the idea that a product like an ACI or an NSX or whatever is the goal, right? And again, I think that the emphasis should be less on the technology and more on what we're actually trying to do. And if you get to that point, I think you would quickly realize that what we're trying to do isn't really that complicated. It's just all very new. And the reason it's all very new is because we haven't really done it yet as an industry. We have been, as Tyler said earlier, very afraid to do things in production. So the line between network automation and SDN has become very, very blurry. So we don't really know what we're calling SDN anymore. There's so many different rabbit holes we could go down on this, but I think the big thing is this, right? Network automation to me is a prerequisite for what I'm thinking of when I think SDN. And I hate, it's become so much that I actually hate using that term because it could mean something completely different to somebody else. But I think the prerequisite that network automation is the idea that you can manage your environment holistically, put into place mechanisms for proper garbage collection so that you don't have excessive configuration. Very simple stuff that we're not doing today. After that, we can talk about things like, how do you build network and application, profiles, right? I think the prerequisite for that is having an idea of what your service catalog is, right? From an organizational perspective. I am a network team, or I'm a member of the network team. What is it that I offer to the other parts of the business? What is it that I do? Simple stuff. Bring up a VLAN, whatever. That's not something they care about. How about something a little more general? Bringing up an application in prod. What is the mechanism by which we move from test dev to prod, for instance? And then defining all of those workflows behind the scenes in networking terms. And that's why really we need the networking professionals, because they have to make that translation. They have to be able to understand what is it that what is it we have to do to get service catalog item A to networking speak? What is it that we have to deploy, and what are the things that will change from deploy to deploy? Basically variabilizing all that stuff. If that's SDN, then fine, whatever. I don't really, honestly, I'm to the point where I don't really care what it's called. I just know that we need it, and as Matt Stone would say, shut up and go write code. So, like I said, there's more to that. But, within the hour that we have, well, probably 5 minutes now, but that's about it.
Yeah. So my take on it is kind of development. It's from a development point of view. I think that programmability at the like OpenFlow level definitely has some use. However, using OpenFlow from my perspective is akin to making IOCTL calls to the Linux kernel or making netlink socket calls to the Linux kernel. It's kind of very, very low level, and only a very few people will do that kind of low level programming. I think the whole SDN revolution kind of started because we wanted to be able to easily manipulate our networking devices programmatically. And I don't think that means programming the freaking TCAM. I think that means being able to programmatically stand up a BGP neighbor. I think that means programmatically being able to provision VLANs. I think that means programmatically being able to change which spanning tree protocol route I have. I think that was kind of probably the promise of SDN, and that's what people got excited about. And OpenFlow may have been the first kind of thing to come on the scene about that, but I think it's so low level and so few people will actually know how to write to it that I don't know that it might be used specifically, and it might be like a ships in the night kind of deal where it may run alongside traditional networking, but only a select few amount of applications I think will actually be able to take use of being able to program the TCAM at that level, just because it is so low level. I don't know what y'all's thoughts on that are, but that's kind of my take on it from a development stance. And so I think that, to me, SDN is more about management plane centralization than it is separating the control plane from the data plane. Because I think when you look at networking as a whole and you look at what I traditionally think out of pain points for networking, it's not, well, damn, I really wish that I could provision a 4-tuple in the TCAM. No, it's that, man, I really wish that I could automate X command that I need to go touch every device to do, or this subset of devices to do. I think that's kind of what the pain point, and that's the annoyance that we're trying to solve. And I think you could solve it with OpenFlow or something similar, but I think it would be accustomed to trying to say, like, okay, new guy to programming, why don't you go write some IOCTL calls to the Linux kernel to get that done, when there's a library that's much higher level that could do it for you. And I know I'm using like really development style terms, but for those of you who have developed it all will know kind of what I'm talking about. I think
the one thing you're hammering, and the one word that I use, I mean, one of the biggest buzzwords that's been thrown around that I hope at least some people understand, but the word abstraction is what you're hitting on, right? It's the idea of, use whatever widget is appropriate for the specific problem, but don't require that the person that's actually making the change or that is the subject matter expert on the problem to know how that works, right? Their job is to sort of define the high-level workflow rather than the specific nerd knobs. It's like I said earlier, ultimately my users aren't going to care whether or not I use NXAPI or netconf. They just won't. It's not going to be a relevant detail to them. What they care about is the architecture, and they care about how the devices interact with each other. So.
Right. And as a developer, I could care less if Juniper has a netconf implementation, but my eyes perk up when I find out they have a Python library that I can just consume in that form. Because nobody likes serialization. Nobody likes to serialize data to a device. That's miserable. And so if a company says, hey, here's this library, that gives me total freedom. I'm just like, yes, please, yes. So I think this is probably a good time to wrap that up. I would like to, if I could, Jeremy and Tyler, I don't know if y'all want to kind of end with kind of how we can get a hold of you on the nets, where we can find y'all. I think that would be a good place to wrap it up, and then we'll do that. Jeremy, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So on Twitter, I am at NWK Automaniac, so Network Automaniac. It's NWK Automaniac. My wife says I have a Twitter problem, so that's probably a great way to reach me. I'm also core developer on the Junos Python Easy micro framework. So there's a TechWiki, techwiki.juniper.net, which is the main project page, and then from there you'll see how to get a hold of us there's a Google Groups that is our community support, and then there's videos and GitHub. So really that's the best way to get a hold of me. Of course, you can always reach me at Juniper. which is my first initial last name at juniper.net. And I'm always out there for the community. Questions about Python or just network automation in general. This is all I do, guys. It's all I think about every day. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. Tyler, how about you? How can we find you?
Twitter, OSS_stack. I don't check it, and I'm not as active as I used to be. So if you send me a DM, I'll probably answer you. If you just mention, I may or may not. So that's yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. It's been fantastic.
All right, keeping it classless. Mute problems. Matt O, how can we find you on the internet?
Yeah, no. Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Mierdin, M-I-E-R-D-I-N. and my blog's at keepingitclassy.net.
That was the most awkward interaction ever of my whole life.
Don't start with me.
Oh, God.
You got like a 10-second delay, so like I thought it was funny, and then you were like moving on, and then like I moved on, and then you started laughing, and I started laughing.
I don't even want to be able to find you on the internet anymore. You're done.
Yeah,
I'm muting you. I'm at Big M Stone on Twitter, and bigmstone.com is my infrequent place that I blog. This will be up on Google, on YouTube's, like now. So appreciate all the guys who watch live. The last thing I would want to end with, and this is, I'm going to say this and hit the stop broadcast button, is everybody has been talking about this SDN thing. If you are inclined to write code, just stop talking about it and start making some commits to something. Go do it. That's really what we need more than anything, is people who are on the front lines of this really trying to push it. So just get out there, write some code. Nobody cares if it's crap. Cisco doesn't care if they have their libraries measure a negative number on Pilot. So get out there and write some code. That's all what it is, you know what I'm saying? Just write some code, let's do this thing. So I'm ending the broadcast.